From Ponzi schemes to fraudulent inventions, these scammers fooled investors out of billions. Today, we're counting down the top 10 biggest scammers ever discovered. These individuals have committed acts of frauds on a massive scale, deceiving countless investors and leaving behind a trail of devastation. Some of them became household names, while others operated under the radar for years. But all of them had one thing in common: they were masters of deception. 1. Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme is considered the largest financial fraud in history, affecting thousands of investors and causing losses of approximately $65 billion. Madoff was a respected financial advisor and former chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, and his scheme lasted for decades before it was finally uncovered in 2008. He used new investors' money to pay off earlier investors and created false statements to deceive his clients. Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison, and his family was also heavily impacted by his actions. His wife, Ruth, was forced to forfeit $80 million in assets, and his sons, Mark and Andrew, both died by suicide. 2. Charles Ponzi. Charles Ponzi is considered the original mastermind behind the Ponzi scheme, which is named after him. In the early 20th century, he promised investor returns of 50% in just 45 days through his company, Securities Exchange Company. Ponzi claimed to be arbitraging international reply coupons, but in reality, he was using new investors' money to pay off earlier investors. The scheme eventually collapsed, and Ponzi was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Despite his conviction, Ponzi continued to run similar schemes and was later deported to Italy. 3. Jordan Belfort. Jordan Belfort, also known as the Wolf of Wall Street, ran a boiler room operation that defrauded investors out of millions of dollars through his firm, Stratton Oakmont. Belfort and his associates used high-pressure sales tactics to sell worthless securities to unsuspecting investors, and they manipulated the stock market to inflate the prices of the stocks they sold. Belfort was eventually caught and served 22 months in prison. After his release, he became a motivational speaker and author, using his experiences to warn others about the dangers of greed and fraud in the financial industry. 4. Frank Abagail. Frank Abagail is known as one of the most famous imposters in history. In the 1960s, Abagail impersonated various professionals and cashed millions of dollars in fraudulent checks. He also posed as an airline pilot, flying more than 1 million miles across 26 countries without a license. Abagail was eventually caught and sentenced to 12 years in prison, but he was released early on the condition that he would help the government prevent fraud. He later became a consultant for the FBI and has since helped catch thousands of fraudsters. Abagail's story was portrayed in the movie Catch Me If You Can, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. 5. Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes is a former Silicon Valley entrepreneur who founded Theranos, a company that claimed to have developed a revolutionary blood testing technology that required only a few drops of blood. Holmes was hailed as a visionary, and the company was valued at $9 billion at its peak. However, it was later discovered that the technology didn't work as promised, and the company was using third-party devices to conduct its tests. In 2018, Holmes and her business partner were charged with multiple counts of fraud, including wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Holmes' trial began in 2021, and she could face up to 20 years in prison if convicted. The case has drawn widespread attention due to high profile of the company and its founder. 6. Alan Stanford. Alan Stanford was a prominent businessman who ran a Ponzi scheme that lasted over a decade. He promised investors high results on certificates of deposit through his bank, Stanford International Bank Limited. However, the results were based on fraudulent investors, and he used new investors' money to pay off earlier investors. The scheme was eventually uncovered by the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC), and Stanford was charged with multiple counts of fraud. In 2012, he was sentenced to 110 years in prison, and his assets were seized to compensate his victims. 7. Lou Pearlman. Lou Pearlman was a music producer who created popular boy bands like NSYNC and Backstreet Boys. However, he was also involved in a Ponzi scheme that swindled investors out of millions of dollars. Pearlman promised high returns on investments in his company, Transcontinental Airlines, but the money was used to fund his lavish lifestyle and pay off earlier investors. Pearlman was eventually caught and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His assets were seized to compensate his victims. 8. Kevin Trudeau. Kevin Trudeau is a prolific fraudster who has been involved in various schemes, including selling fraudulent weight loss products and books. Trudeau claimed that his products could cure various diseases and illnesses, but they were found to be ineffective and fraudulent. He was fined millions of dollars by the Federal Trade Commission (FTC) and sentenced to several years in prison. Despite his repeated legal troubles, Trudeau continues to promote fraudulent products and has faced further charges and fines. 9. Samuel Israel III. Samuel Israel III was the founder of Bayou Hedge Fund Group, which he used to defraud investors out of approximately $450 million. Israel created false financial statements and claimed that the fund had high returns, but the money was actually used to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Israel was eventually caught and sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, he faked his own suicide and went on the run, leading to an international manhunt. He was eventually caught and sentenced to additional 2 years in prison. His assets were seized and sold to compensate his victims. 10. Enron. Enron was an energy company that engaged in fraudulent accounting practices and manipulated financial statements to hide its losses and inflate its profits. Enron's executives, including CEO Jeffrey Skilling and CFO Andrew Fastov, created complex financial structures to deceive investors and inflate stock prices. The company eventually collapsed, causing losses of approximately $74 billion and leading to the loss of thousands of jobs. Skilling and Fastow were both convicted of multiple charges of fraud and conspiracy, and they received lengthy prison sentences. So, that's it for today. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell button to get all the latest updates.